I think here in cities like Buffalo, like Rochester, like your Rust Belt, a lot of it is generational, and it's come from just systemic poverty and, to be quite honest, institutional racism over the generations. And I do think that factors in here in the city, having been a couple places. The segregation here is unbelievable. I think I even notice more racist attitudes when I go out and just talk to people and listen to people than I've ever heard. And I think it's it's a subliminal thing, and it's so part of the culture here that a lot of people don't recognize it, as such. But it's those attitudes. When you look at what happened in the city a couple of years ago, when you had all these kids at failing schools, and by state law they had to find an alternative, and the words were barely uttered, the possibility of them going to suburban districts, and people went nuts. And why is that? Why do people have such an issue with taking a couple kids and giving them a better educational opportunity? And I do think that in Buffalo is a very deep-seated and deep-rooted cultural thing that has a lot to do with our history, has a lot to do with our economy, and the fact that for all people, opportunities have not been readily available. And then I think you have a situation where, when I lost my job at the factory and I see that maybe I lost it and there's this affirmative action program, it's easy to start casting blame. So it's a huge issue in this community, and I don't think it's one that people are talking about, but the result is you have these, incredible concentrations of poverty in certain areas, and that becomes very difficult then to deal with on such a large scale.
I read a quote, and it said that the kids aren't going to succeed without their parents succeeding. Do you believe in that? What is your take on that?
It's kind of a nuanced thing. There's no question that parents are very important, and I know, just when you talk about people I know personally, friends I have who have lived in poverty and come up through poverty, you do see, there's nothing comparable to having a support system and parents and family. There's also, one issue we didn't talk about prior, but teen pregnancy is something I'm very interested in, especially in urban areas where you have high numbers of women who get pregnant. And in the city of Buffalo, I think it's 600 girls a year. And there are statistics that show that the single most important indicator of whether you will succeed is if your mother finished high school. So when you look at the challenges against teen moms in the city, that said, I don't think if a parent is not involved, which is often the case in urban school districts, that you can just write off those kids. I think that's where it's really incumbent on schools and the community to figure out how do you support those kids. Because the reality is, one superintendent I covered pointed out, he said the reality is a lot of the kids who are in our classrooms now, their parents are also or should be in our classrooms. To that point, I think that's part of the reason I am interested in the pregnancy rates in the city, because you do have this reality. A lot of people don't agree with it. You hear a lot about the prevention, but you don't hear as much about, well, what do you do when you do have all these kids? And if you think of it in the context of, you're not just talking about a teenager, you're talking about their child. And if you think about 600 babies born to teen moms in the city of Buffalo, where will those kids end up in 5 years? And the reality is they'll be in the Buffalo public schools. So I think that's my interest in that issue more, is if we can get past that one kind of argument and controversial debate and really think about those kids are probably going to be your most at-risk kids when they enter the school system. So there's that kind of what kind of support systems are in place, especially for kids even that young. Going to school in a culture where from day one it hasn't been you're going to college. You've got tons of kids that get to high school and are behind, so then they have to spend time doing remedial work, and they're not spending time earning a regents or doing AP classes or college coursework.
So that leads me to this. The media tends to focus on the waterfront, downtown, and medical campus. Do you think the city is kind of focusing on the wrong things and not what's really important?
I do, and that's the other thing I notice here is I think that, the city is so desperate. I mean, even Katie Couric here yesterday, I mean, did anyone see a picture of her touring the east side? Like, did anyone ask the question of, how are all these jobs on the medical campus helping the parts of the city that need it most? I didn't see it. And I think, I think it's disingenuous as a city, and that's the perfect example. You have a national media figure that's coming here, and nobody wants to talk about the segregation issues, the racial issues. Say Yes does actually have that conversation, and the guy, not to be harping them too much, but when you listen to the people in the city, they're one of the only voices you will ever hear point out and say, we're going to need people working at the medical campus that are not, you're not going to recruit thousands of people from out of this area or out of this country, and quite frankly, do you really want to when you have so many people here out of work and in need of opportunity? I think the media is very guilty of it too, because there's, like I said, the city's been so desperate for something to kind of shine a bright future that it's easy to kind of push these other issues aside. But I would argue if we don't address these issues now, they are only going to get worse. And when you talk to kids in the city schools at a very young age, you can detect this sense of hopelessness. And we just cannot afford to have generations of kids who give up by the time they even reach high school because they don't see a job for them at the medical campus or an ability to go have a meal at 716.
So would you say that obviously poverty is a pretty vicious cycle that just continues on. Would you say that the best way for that to end is to get people educated?
I do, and I really do think, and this is something else I think people don't focus on enough. I mean, quite honestly, across the whole state. I was somewhat floored when I came here from Florida, and there, while I was in Florida, there was a big push for early literacy, because it stands to reason if you can't read, you're not going to do well in your other subjects. And when I came to New York, there was a big fixation on graduation rates. And so, granted, the tests are the tests, whatever you make of them, but you would look at indicators of how well kids were reading, and you'd think, why less than half of your kids graduate? Because they can't read when they're in third grade. And I think you're starting to hear that conversation now on the academic level. Again, let's go back to the teen moms. If you're, we all probably went to preschool. I think I started in preschool when I was 3. I lived in a safe environment. My mother had all of her prenatal, postnatal care. A lot of kids are not getting that in a very early period of their life where they need it. And, so that's, I think, an area where there needs to be some focus on really addressing these kids through the education system, but thinking about it and catching them early enough that you can put them on a better path. He looked up to his brother. His brother was the only male role model in his life. His brother was in a gang, so he used to want to go stand out on the corner and deal drugs with his brother. And the brother always told him, you do not want to end up like this. Go home, get ready for school, do your homework, get ready for school the next day. So the kid's out there one day talking to his brother, and the brother says the same thing, go home, do your homework, and get ready for school. And by the time the kid gets home, his grandmother's getting the call that his brother got shot. And you could just see the kid telling the story that was really the moment where his life spun off track. And, and then one of the guys I know, who, again, if you have time, would be a great interview, grew up on the east side. He's now, a high-level administrator in Rochester. And one of the things he would always say is, a kid in the suburbs, if their grandparent dies or pet dies, they get more counseling and emotional support than a lot of these kids in the city when they see or have to deal with, another child getting killed in their neighborhood. His dad was a drug dealer, his mother was a drug addict, he got bounced around between different homes, grandparents, foster homes, and he told me a story once that was just heart-wrenching, that when he was with his grandmother, she was really too old to get them to school safely, and so his older sister would walk them. And when his older sister was sick, he couldn't go to school because he had no way to really get there. He was too young. And he would tell me how just heartbreaking it was that he couldn't go to school. And you think, I took my fair share of cookie days.
Right,
You know,
exactly.
we take advantage, and you know, I've asked him too, what was it about school that you liked? And he'd say, you know, it was the one place I could go where adults were there who cared about me and were very nurturing, and your teachers looked out for you. Kid's father was in jail for murdering his mother in a very brutal criminal incident. And, you know, we debated whether to interview the kid because young children aren't always very articulate to start. And, you know, you don't ever want to put a child in a position where you're taking advantage of them. So, but we could tell when we interviewed his grandmother, he was kind of watching us and kind of curious. And so I said, well, do you want to go and talk to us? And I think I asked him, you know, just what the neighborhood was like, and he talked about hearing gunshots and, you know, not being able to play outside when there were things happening. And I asked him, well, how does that make you feel? And this 10-year-old kid said, I feel like I'm in a cage. And you just heard that, and you're like, well, how profound. I mean, and so you don't necessarily want to talk to the kid because you think, does he understand what's going on, and will he be able to articulate it? And I think he put it in like the most eloquent 10-year-old kid. And we had that on, I mean, because we did a video and we ran that in Rochester. But it was unbelievable because you just, sometimes I think people don't realize how much kids are processing. Read in third grade. If you can't read in third grade, can you read in fourth grade, fifth, sixth? By the time you get to high school, you know, are you so far behind? Where do you think you're going to end up? Do you see yourself going to college? You know, are your classes more difficult because you don't have these basic skills? And then you do. You hear from a lot of kids that, and then what is your family situation? Are you eating at night? You know, are you watching your younger siblings not eat at night? And for a lot of kids, what happens is it's a lot easier when school is so difficult to just get up and walk out that door and go try to make a living for your family some other way. You know, and you'll hear about the dynamic of, you know, you get kids who are in gangs, and we're not talking about the Crips and the Bloods or anything here, but that's a very real issue. And I've heard, you know, young people talk to me too that you might be going to class and sitting next to the guy who shows up periodically, all dressed, you know, in expensive clothes and driving a nice car and picking up the chick, and you're sitting there thinking, well, what am I doing here, feeling stupid day after day? So the drug issue is a big part of this, and I think the reason you don't see them correlated a whole lot is because, and same thing even with academic, no one wants to say that just because you're poor or you come from poverty, you're not going to make it. No one wants to say a kid who's poor coming from poverty is not going to make it in, you know, the city school district. The reality is, especially when you have so many of these kids, I mean, I have teachers that have told me they ask the class, you know, how many of you have seen a shooting or know somebody that's been killed, and they all raise their hands. And, you know, a lot of the crime is driven by the drug trade. Noticed that he was an assistant principal, like 80% of his behavior referrals and suspension were these same 20 kids. And he knew, because he knew the kids, they were in his office, you know, this kid's dad is in prison for murdering his mother, no joke. You know, this kid's mom is a stripper and disappears and doesn't come home. You know, these kids were dealing with some serious issues, and again, elementary school. So he thought, if I can get them in an environment and teach them, you know, personal responsibility, self-respect. One of the things he said is you may have a reason, but you don't have an excuse. And the whole goal was to help these kids manage the issues they were dealing with on their own at 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, so that he knew if they could tackle that, they could be successful. And the guy invited me, he was so dynamic, I said, could we follow you for your first year doing this? And he's like, sure. So I'm thinking he's nuts, because you know, a reporter and a photographer come in pretty much whenever we feel like it, and you have no idea what you're going to see. But I tell you, every time I walked into that school, it would have looked like walking into Canisius, because the kids all had shirts and ties. They'd stand up when you entered the classroom, they'd greet you, and it was just, you know, and it showed you if you could get those kids when they're young and get them on the right path at that age, that is how we're going to fix this issue.